Welcome to this deep analysis of one of the darkest and most disturbing stories in American history. Tell us where you're watching from. I ask that you subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue bringing stories in this format. Well, here it is. The afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of the Charleston Historical Society archives in West Virginia, casting long shadows across rows of filing cabinets and archival boxes that held the forgotten memories of Appalachian families spanning over 2 centuries. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a 42-year-old historian specializing in early 20th century Appalachian social structures, carefully removed a collection of glass plate negatives from a recently donated estate. The donation had come from the descendants of the Hannon family, once prominent coal mine owners in McDowell County, who had occupied a sprawling estate in the mountains near Welch between 1890 and 1930. That Sarah had been working on a comprehensive study examining the lives of domestic workers in wealthy Appalachian households during the coal boom era, a period when fortunes were made rapidly and social hierarchies became rigidly defined in communities that had previously been relatively egalitarian. The Hannon collection represented a rare opportunity to examine the daily lives of both the affluent family and their household staff through photographic evidence, personal correspondence, and detailed household ledgers that tracked everything from coal deliveries to servant wages. The glass plates were remarkably well preserved, having been stored in the cool, dry basement of the Hannon estate for nearly a century before being discovered by the family's great-great-grandson during an estate sale preparation. Each plate was carefully wrapped in yellowed newspaper from 1923, the year the family had abandoned the estate following a series of financial setbacks and personal tragedies that had devastated the once powerful dynasty. Sarah worked methodically through the collection, scanning each plate with a high-resolution digital scanner that could capture details invisible to the naked eye, creating archival-quality images that would be preserved for future researchers. Most of the photographs depicted formal family portraits, elaborate dinner parties, and views of the estate's extensive gardens and outbuildings. The Hannon family patriarch, Jonathan Hannon, appeared in many images as a stern-faced man with a thick mustache and penetrating eyes that seemed to assess the value of everything they gazed upon. His wife, Catherine, appeared more fragile, her thin frame often positioned at the edge of photographs as if she were trying to disappear into the elaborate wallpaper and heavy draperies that characterized the interior shots. Their 3 children appeared at various ages throughout the collection: eldest son Marcus, who seemed to inherit his father's commanding presence; daughter Elizabeth, whose expressions ranged from melancholy to defiant across different photographs; and youngest son Thomas, who rarely looked directly at the camera. The household staff appeared in several photographs, though always positioned in ways that emphasized their subordinate status. They stood at the edges of group photos, their faces often slightly blurred as if they had moved during the long exposure times required by early 20th century photography. One young woman appeared repeatedly in the background of various images, her presence so consistent that Sarah began to recognize her immediately when scanning new plates. The woman appeared to be in her late teens or early 20s, with delicate features and dark hair pulled back severely from her face in the fashion typical of domestic servants of that era. Sarah had scanned through approximately 40 plates when she reached an image that immediately captured her attention. The photograph showed the entire Hannon family arranged formally in the main parlor of their estate, a room Sarah recognized from other images as the most elaborate space in the house, featuring imported furniture, oriental rugs, and an enormous fireplace framed by carved mahogany. The composition was typical of formal family portraits from that period. The patriarch seated prominently in the center, his wife standing slightly behind and to his right. The children arranged according to age and gender in positions that reflected their status within the family hierarchy. What distinguished this particular photograph was the presence of the young maid, positioned not at the edge of the frame or in the background, but standing between Elizabeth and Thomas, her posture as formal and composed as any family member. Her clothing was clearly that of a domestic servant, a simple dark dress with a white apron and collar, but her positioning within the group suggested a relationship to the family that transcended her employee status. Her face was clearly visible, captured in sharp focus by the camera, revealing delicate features, large eyes that stared directly at the lens, and an expression that Sarah found difficult to interpret, neither subservient nor defiant, but rather possessing a quiet dignity that seemed at odds with her servant's uniform. Sarah zoomed in on the digital scan, using the high-resolution capabilities of her equipment to examine details that would have been impossible to see in a physical print. The young woman's hands were clasped in front of her, holding something that appeared at first glance to be a simple handkerchief or piece of cloth. Sarah increased the magnification further, adjusting the contrast and brightness to bring out details obscured by the age of the negative and the limitations of early photographic technology. As the image resolved at higher magnification, Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. The object in the young woman's hands was not a handkerchief, but a small bundle wrapped in white cloth, the kind of wrapping typically used for infant clothing in that era. The shape was unmistakable once Sarah knew what she was looking at: a baby's gown, carefully folded and held with a tenderness that contrasted sharply with the formal rigidity of everyone else in the photograph. Sarah's mind immediately began racing through possibilities. Why would a maid be holding baby clothes in a formal family portrait? Whose child had worn that gown? And why had this particular photograph been taken with the servant positioned as if she were a family member rather than household staff? Sarah spent the next hour examining every other photograph in the collection that featured the young maid, cross-referencing dates based on the children's apparent ages, the seasons indicated by clothing and visible gardens, and notations on the glass plate envelopes. She discovered that the maid appeared in photographs spanning approximately 5 years, from around 1917 to 1922. In the earliest images, she appeared younger, perhaps 16 or 17, her face still carrying traces of adolescence. In the later photographs, she looked older, more serious, her expression becoming increasingly withdrawn as the years progressed. One photograph from what appeared to be 1919 showed the maid standing alone in the estate's garden, her hand resting on an ornate iron gate that led to a small family cemetery visible in the background. Unlike the formal posed photographs, this image had a candid quality, as if the photographer had captured her unaware. Her face was turned toward the cemetery, and even across the decades and through the limitations of the photographic medium, Sarah could perceive a profound sadness in her posture and expression. Sarah pulled the household ledgers from the Hannon collection, thick volumes bound in cracked leather that recorded the mundane details of running a large estate: coal deliveries, grocery expenses, repair costs, and staff wages. She found regular entries for household staff salaries, including payments to a cook, a groundskeeper, a driver, and a maid identified simply as Mary B. The entries for Mary's wages began in April 1917, consistent with the photographic evidence, and continued through November 1922, when they abruptly ceased with a notation in different handwriting: departed service, paid in full. Sarah searched through the ledgers for any additional information about Mary, finding occasional entries for clothing allowances, medical expenses, and once, in December 1919, a substantial payment marked special consideration that was 10 times Mary's usual monthly wage. The entry had been made in the same elegant handwriting that appeared throughout the ledgers, presumably Catherine Hannon's hand, and was accompanied by no explanation or context. The personal correspondence in the collection consisted primarily of business letters between Jonathan Hannon and various coal company associates, legal documents related to mining operations, and a few letters between family members during periods when they were separated. Sarah found nothing that directly referenced Mary or explained the unusual photograph, but one letter from Elizabeth Hannon to her mother, dated August 1920, contained a passage that caught Sarah's attention. "I visited the cemetery again today, as I do most afternoons. The stone is beautiful, Mother, exactly as you designed it. Mary was there as well, as she always is. We did not speak, but I felt we understood each other in the silence. Some griefs are too profound for words, and some truths too complicated for simple condemnation or forgiveness." Sarah photographed the letter and added it to her growing file on the Hannon family and their mysterious maid. She spent the remainder of that afternoon and the following 3 days carefully examining every document, photograph, and record in the collection, building a timeline and searching for clues that might explain what she had discovered. The more she researched, the more convinced she became that the photograph and the baby's gown represented something significant, a story that had been deliberately obscured but not quite erased from the historical record. Her research expanded beyond the Hannon collection to other archives and records. She searched through McDowell County vital records, finding birth and death certificates for the Hannon family members but nothing for any child that might explain the baby gown in the photograph. She examined census records, discovering that Mary's full name was Mary Grace Breslin, born in 1899 in a small mining community 20 miles from the Hannon estate, the daughter of Irish immigrants who had come to West Virginia seeking work in the coal mines. The census records showed Mary living at the Hannon estate from 1917 through 1920, but after that year, she disappeared from the records entirely, with no subsequent census entry, no marriage record, and no death certificate in the county files. Sarah reached out to colleagues specializing in Appalachian genealogy and social history, sharing the photograph and the limited information she had gathered. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. Other historians recognized the significance of what Sarah had found, evidence of a story that had been common in wealthy households of that era but rarely documented photographically or acknowledged in family records. The positioning of Mary in the family photograph, the baby gown, the substantial payment in the ledgers, and Elizabeth's cryptic letter all pointed to a narrative that Sarah was becoming increasingly certain she understood, though without additional evidence, it remained speculative. The research into Mary Breslin's background required Sarah to travel to McDowell County, driving through the winding mountain roads that had once been the heart of America's coal country. The landscape still bore the scars of intensive mining operations, abandoned tipples, company towns slowly being reclaimed by forest, and slag heaps that would take centuries to fully revegetate. The community where Mary had been born no longer existed as a functioning town, just a few collapsed structures and a small cemetery where many of the Irish immigrant miners and their families had been buried. Sarah located records at the county courthouse that painted a picture of Mary's early life. Her father, Patrick Breslin, had died in a mine accident in 1915 when Mary was 16 years old. Her mother, Kathleen, had died of influenza in 1917, leaving Mary an orphan with no siblings and few prospects in a community that offered limited opportunities for young women without family connections or resources. The timing of Kathleen's death in March 1917 coincided with Mary's appearance in the Hannon household ledgers the following month, suggesting that Mary had sought or been offered employment as a domestic servant following her mother's death. The Hannon estate still stood, though decades of neglect had transformed it from a symbol of wealth and power into a slowly deteriorating monument to a vanished era. The current owner, a distant Hannon cousin who used the property as a vacation home a few weeks each year, had agreed to let Sarah tour the building and grounds. Walking through the empty rooms, Sarah could imagine the life Mary must have lived there. The early morning wake-ups to light fires and prepare breakfast, the endless cycle of cleaning, laundry, and meal preparation, the social isolation of being neither family nor equal, existing in a liminal space between the wealthy inhabitants and the world beyond the estate gates. The parlor where the family portrait had been taken remained largely unchanged, the same mahogany fireplace and ornate moldings, still visible beneath decades of dust and fading paint. Sarah stood where Mary must have stood for that photograph, trying to understand what circumstances had led to a mere servant being included in such a formal family portrait in a position typically reserved for family members. In the rigid social hierarchy of early 20th century Appalachia, particularly in wealthy households, such a breach of convention would have required extraordinary circumstances or represented a deliberate statement. The cemetery Elizabeth had mentioned in her letter was located about a quarter-mile from the main house, enclosed by the iron gate Sarah had seen in one of the photographs. Inside, Sarah found several Hannon family graves, including a large monument for Jonathan Hannon, who had died in 1932, and a smaller marker for Catherine, who had died in 1927. The children's graves were more scattered. Marcus had died in France during World War I. Thomas had lived until 1975, and Elizabeth had died unmarried in 1968, having spent her final decades living quietly in Charleston. Among the family graves, Sarah found what she had been searching for, a small white marble headstone, simpler than the family monuments but clearly placed with care in a prominent position near the center of the cemetery. The inscription was brief: Baby Catherine Hannon. Born and died October 7, 1919. Beloved. Below the dates, a second line had been added, "Forgiven and remembered with love." Sarah photographed the headstone from multiple angles, documenting its position relative to the family graves and noting the quality of the marble and carving, which suggested significant expense. The dates provided a crucial piece of evidence. October 1919, coinciding with the substantial payment to Mary in the household ledgers in December of that year, 2 months after the baby's birth and death. The name, Catherine, connected the child directly to Catherine Hannon, though whether through actual family relationship or as an honorific remained unclear. Returning to Charleston, Sarah expanded her research to include newspaper archives from McDowell County, searching for any mention of births, deaths, or scandals involving the Hannon family around 1919. She found extensive coverage of the family's business activities, Jonathan's role in expanding coal production during World War I, and social notices about elaborate parties and charitable activities. In the October 9, 1919 edition of the Welch Daily News, she found a brief notice. The Jonathan Hannon family requests privacy during a time of family mourning. No visitors, please. No additional details were provided, and subsequent newspapers made no further reference to any death or loss in the family. The silence in the public record stood in stark contrast to the elaborate grief commemoration visible in the cemetery and suggested in the family correspondence. In wealthy families of that era, infant deaths were common and typically acknowledged publicly with funeral notices and expressions of community sympathy. The absence of such public acknowledgement suggested something unusual about this particular death, something the family had chosen to handle privately. Sarah located a retired local historian named James Caldwell who had spent decades researching McDowell County families and preserving oral histories from elderly residents who remembered the coal boom era. James, now in his 80s, met Sarah at a diner in Welch and listened with interest as she described her research. His response provided crucial context. The Hannons were complicated people, like most of the mine owner families. Jonathan was ruthless in business but tried to present himself as a paternalistic figure, taking care of his workers while extracting maximum profit from their labor. Catherine was different, more genuinely concerned about people, particularly women and children. She funded a school for miners' children, paid for medical care when workers were injured, things that Jonathan tolerated but never fully supported. James continued, explaining the social dynamics of that era. Young women in service to wealthy families were vulnerable in ways we don't always acknowledge in sanitized histories. Some families protected their servants and treated them with basic human decency. Others exploited them in every way imaginable. And sometimes, the situation was complicated, involving genuine affection alongside the power imbalance that made any relationship between employer and servant inherently unequal and potentially exploitative. He paused before adding, "I've heard stories about the Hannons over the years." Whispers, really? Nothing documented. People said there was a scandal around 1919 or 20, something involving one of the sons and a servant girl. The family closed ranks, and the girl disappeared. Some said she was paid off and sent away. Others said she died in childbirth, which wasn't uncommon in those days. The baby supposedly died too, or maybe there never was a baby, and the whole thing was exaggerated gossip. After that, the family seemed different, more withdrawn. Jonathan became harder, Catherine more melancholy. The estate felt haunted, people said, though not by ghosts, just by sadness and secrets. Sarah shared the photograph with James, watching his face as he examined the image of Mary holding the baby gown. He studied it for a long time before speaking. "That's grief you're seeing in how she's holding that little gown. And look at the family around her." Jonathan looks angry, like he's barely containing his fury at having to include her in this photograph. Catherine looks devastated but resolute, like she's made a decision she knows is right but costs her dearly. The daughter, Elizabeth, she's looking at Mary, not at the camera, and her expression is compassionate, almost protective. The younger son, Thomas, he looks confused, like he doesn't understand why the rules have suddenly changed. And Marcus isn't there at all, but he would have been dead by then, killed in France. James pointed to details Sarah had noticed but not fully interpreted. The photograph itself is unusual. Family portraits were formal events. carefully staged to project the image the family wanted to present to the world. Including a servant in the photograph, positioned as an equal, holding something as intimate as a baby's gown. That's not just unusual, it's revolutionary for that time and place. This photograph is either evidence of extraordinary compassion or a forced acknowledgement of something that couldn't be hidden. Probably both. Catherine Hannon was making a statement with this photograph, claiming something or someone that society said she had no right to claim. Sarah returned to her office at the Historical Society with renewed determination to uncover the complete story. She requested additional records from surrounding counties, searching for any trace of Mary Breslin after 1922. She contacted descendants of other families who had employed servants during that era, looking for oral histories or family stories that might provide comparative context. She reached out to specialists in photographic analysis to examine the original glass plate for any additional clues that might be revealed through advanced imaging techniques. The photograph was sent to a laboratory at West Virginia University where specialists in digital restoration and analysis could examine it using techniques unavailable to previous researchers. The enhanced images revealed details that had been invisible in Sarah's initial scans. Mary's hands bore calluses and scars consistent with years of hard labor, but her fingernails had been recently cleaned and trimmed for the photograph, suggesting someone had ensured she looked presentable. The baby gown she held showed intricate embroidery work, expensive and time-consuming, indicating it had been made for a child whose parents had both resources and expectations of a future. Most significantly, the enhanced images revealed that Mary wore a thin silver chain around her neck, barely visible above the high collar of her servant's dress. Hanging from the chain was a small locket, the kind typically used to hold a photograph or lock of hair. The locket appeared to be of good quality, not something a servant would typically be able to afford on standard wages, suggesting it had been a gift or perhaps a family heirloom from her mother. As Sarah pieced together the fragmented evidence, a narrative emerged that was both heartbreaking and representative of countless untold stories from that era. Mary Breslin had arrived at the Hannon estate in April 1917, a 17-year-old orphan desperate for employment and shelter. The household would have included Jonathan and Catherine Hannon, their daughter Elizabeth, who was approximately 19 years old, and their youngest son Thomas, who would have been about 15. Marcus, the eldest son, would have been away at war, not returning until 1918. That the specific dynamics that led to Mary's pregnancy remained speculative without additional evidence, but the photograph and subsequent events suggested a narrative more complex than simple exploitation. If Marcus had been the father, the timing would align with his return from the war in early 1919, his possible relationship with Mary during that period, and the birth of the child in October of that year. Alternatively, Thomas, though younger, might have been involved, which would explain his confused expression in the photograph and the family's apparent protective response toward Mary rather than dismissal. What distinguished this case from countless similar situations was Catherine Hannon's response. Rather than dismissing Mary, paying her off, and destroying any evidence of the child's existence, Catherine had apparently made the extraordinary decision to acknowledge the child publicly within the family, giving the baby the Hannon name and burying her in the family cemetery with a proper headstone. The inclusion of Mary in the family portrait, taken sometime in 1920 or 21 based on Thomas's apparent age, represented an even more radical acknowledgement of Mary's connection to the family through the child. Sarah found additional evidence of Catherine's involvement in local women's organizations during this period, including a shelter for unwed mothers that Catherine had funded anonymously in 1920. Minutes from board meetings of the charitable organization showed that Catherine had insisted on policies that treated unmarried pregnant women with dignity rather than shame, providing medical care, vocational training, and help with infant care rather than forcing women to give up their children. These activities suggested that Catherine's response to Mary's situation reflected a broader philosophy about women's vulnerability and society's obligation to protect rather than punish those who found themselves pregnant outside of marriage. The relationship between Elizabeth Hannon and Mary appeared to have evolved into something resembling friendship, unusual given their different social positions but not unprecedented in households where young women of similar ages found themselves isolated. Together, Elizabeth's letter mentioning their shared silence at the cemetery suggested they had both lost something precious and found some comfort in mutual grief. Records showed that Elizabeth never married and devoted much of her adult life to social work and women's education, perhaps influenced by witnessing Mary's situation and her mother's compassionate response. Jonathan Hannon's role remained more ambiguous. Business records showed his financial success continued through the early 1920s, but personal correspondence became increasingly bitter and critical of societal changes that he perceived as undermining traditional hierarchies and values. His anger in the family photograph might have reflected rage at a situation that challenged his authority and control, or frustration at being compelled by his wife to acknowledge publicly something he would have preferred to keep hidden. The substantial payment to Mary in December 1919 might have been his attempt to resolve the situation through money, while Catherine's actions suggested she understood that some situations required more than financial compensation. Sarah's research into Mary's disappearance after 1922 led to archives in several other states, searching for any record of a Mary Breslin or Mary Hannon who might have left West Virginia during that period. She eventually found a marriage record in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania dated June 1923. Mary Grace Breslin married Robert Joseph Sullivan, a factory worker and World War I veteran. The couple had moved to Pittsburgh's Irish immigrant community, where Mary's background as a domestic servant and orphan would not have been unusual, and any questions about her past could be deflected or ignored in the anonymity of city life. Pittsburgh city directories from the 1920s and 30s showed Robert and Mary Sullivan living at the same address for over 20 years, with Robert listed as a factory foreman and Mary involved in church activities. Records from Sacred Heart Church showed Mary had been active in the Women's Auxiliary and had donated regularly to organizations supporting orphans and widows, suggesting she never forgot her own experiences. The Sullivans had 3 children, a daughter born in 1924 and 2 sons born in 1926 and 1928, creating a new family that allowed Mary to leave behind the tragedy and complicated circumstances of her years at the Hannon estate. Mary Sullivan died in Pittsburgh in 1979 at the age of 80, having outlived her husband by 3 years. Her obituary described her as a devoted mother and grandmother, active in church and community organizations, and beloved by all who knew her. The obituary made no mention of her early life in West Virginia or her time in service to the Hannon family. Among her survivors were 3 children, 8 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren. The obituary noted that in lieu of flowers, donations could be made to a Pittsburgh organization supporting single mothers and their children. Sarah located one of Mary's granddaughters, Patricia Sullivan Brennan, living in a suburb of Pittsburgh. Patricia agreed to meet with Sarah and was fascinated to learn about her grandmother's early life, details that Mary had apparently never fully shared with her children or grandchildren. Patricia provided photographs of Mary in her later years, showing a woman who had aged gracefully, her face bearing the lines of someone who had experienced profound grief but had found peace and purpose in the decades that followed. Patricia shared memories of her grandmother. "She was the most compassionate person I've ever known, always helping others, especially women and children in difficult situations. She would bring groceries to families struggling financially, babysit for single mothers so they could work, visit elderly neighbors who had no family. She never talked about her own past much, just said she'd been an orphan in West Virginia and had come to Pittsburgh as a young woman to start over. She would say that everyone deserves a second chance and that judging others was pointless because you never knew what private griefs and struggles they carried." Patricia hesitated before adding, "There was one thing that seemed significant, though I didn't understand it as a child. Every year in October, on the 7th, my grandmother would be very quiet and sad. She'd go to church alone in the morning, light candles, and spend time in prayer. When she came home, she'd be holding this silver locket she always wore. I asked her once what was in the locket, and she just said it held a memory of someone who had left this world too soon. After she died, we found the locket among her belongings. Inside was a tiny photograph that must have been cut down from a larger image, showing a baby dressed in an elaborate white gown. On the back, written in faded ink, was just a date, October 7th, 1919. Sarah felt the pieces of the puzzle finally coming together. The photograph Patricia described was likely cut from a larger memorial photograph taken of baby Catherine before or shortly after her death, a common practice in that era when infant mortality was high and photographs served as the only visual remembrance of children who died young. The fact that Mary had carried this photograph for 60 years, never showing it to her own children but returning to it privately each year on the anniversary of the baby's death, spoke to the profound and lasting impact of that loss. With Patricia's permission, Sarah examined the locket and the photograph it contained. The baby in the image wore the same elaborate gown visible in the family portrait photograph, confirming the connection. The photograph had been professionally taken, suggesting the Hannon family had commissioned memorial photographs after the baby's death, and that Catherine or Elizabeth had ensured Mary received a copy. The act of providing Mary with this photograph, and later perhaps facilitating her departure from the estate with references and financial support that would allow her to start fresh in Pittsburgh, represented a level of compassion and practical support that went beyond social obligation. Sarah's research expanded to examine the medical circumstances of the baby's death. Hospital records from McDowell County in 1919 showed that infant mortality rates were high, particularly in October and November when seasonal respiratory illnesses spread through communities. Birth and death on the same day were not uncommon, often indicating complications during delivery, premature birth, or congenital conditions incompatible with life. Without access to modern medical care, many infants who would survive today with proper intervention died within hours or days of birth. The notation on the baby's headstone, born and died October 7, 1919, suggested the child had lived only hours at most, perhaps dying during or shortly after a difficult delivery. The subsequent line, "forgiven and remembered with love," took on additional meaning in this context. Forgiven might refer to the circumstances of conception outside marriage, or perhaps more specifically to whatever Hannon family member had been involved with Mary. The phrase suggested Catherine had deliberately chosen words that acknowledged human fallibility while emphasizing love and remembrance over judgment and shame. Sarah contacted a medical historian specializing in maternal and infant health in early 20th century America, who provided context about the dangers women faced during pregnancy and childbirth in that era. Without access to prenatal care, proper nutrition, or emergency medical intervention, complications that would be routine today were often fatal. Young women, particularly those experiencing their first pregnancy under conditions of stress and social isolation, faced particularly high risks. The historian noted that servants who became pregnant often received inadequate medical care, either because employers wanted to hide the situation or because the women themselves feared the consequences of disclosure. The fact that baby Catherine had been buried in the family cemetery with a proper headstone and acknowledged with the Hannon name suggested that despite any initial scandal or conflict, the family had ultimately provided Mary with medical care during her pregnancy and delivery. The substantial payment to Mary 2 months after the baby's death might have covered medical expenses, provided compensation for her loss, or represented an acknowledgement of the family's responsibility in the situation. Catherine's continued support of Mary for another 2 years before Mary's departure suggested ongoing concern for her welfare. Sarah's research culminated in a comprehensive article for the Journal of Appalachian History, titled "Visible and Invisible: Servant Agency and Elite Responsibility in the Photographic Record of the Hannon Family, 1917 to 1923. The article used the mysterious family portrait as an entry point for examining broader questions about power, gender, class, and social responsibility in early 20th century Appalachia. The photograph became evidence not just of one family's story, but of the complex human realities that existed behind the formal facades of wealthy households. The article generated significant interest among historians, genealogists, and the general public. Several newspapers ran features about Sarah's research, focusing on the human interest aspects of Mary's story and the unusual compassion shown by Catherine Hannon. Online discussions debated the ethics of the relationships involved, the extent to which Catherine's actions represented genuine care versus social damage control, and what Mary's experience revealed about the limited choices available to young working-class women in that era. Some descendants of the Hannon family contacted Sarah with additional information and family stories that had been passed down through generations. Thomas Hannon's daughter, now elderly herself, revealed that her father had spoken near the end of his life about the greatest regret of my youth, involving a young woman who had worked for the family and had suffered because of his foolishness and cowardice. Thomas had apparently been the father of Mary's child, a 15-year-old boy whose relationship with the 17-year-old servant had resulted in pregnancy, scandal, and consequences neither teenager had been mature enough to understand or handle. Thomas's daughter explained that Catherine Hannon had taken control of the situation, protecting both her son and Mary from the worst social consequences while insisting that responsibility be acknowledged and support provided. The family portrait including Mary had been Catherine's way of ensuring that even if the broader community never knew the full story, there would be photographic evidence that Mary had been welcomed as part of the family during the most difficult period of her life. The positioning of Mary in the photograph, standing between Elizabeth and Thomas, physically connected her to the family members who had provided support during her pregnancy and grief. Jonathan Hannon's resistance to Catherine's decisions had apparently caused significant marital conflict, with Jonathan arguing that including Mary in family photographs and acknowledging the baby publicly would damage the family's reputation and social standing. Catherine had apparently threatened to leave Jonathan and expose certain questionable business practices if he didn't support her decisions regarding Mary and the baby. The financial success that allowed the family to maintain their lifestyle depended significantly on Catherine's family connections and inherited wealth, giving her leverage that she used to protect Mary and maintain her own moral standards even when they conflicted with social conventions. Elizabeth Hannon's letters from later in life, found among family papers and shared with Sarah by descendants, revealed that watching her mother support Mary had profoundly influenced Elizabeth's own life choices. Elizabeth had rejected several marriage proposals from wealthy men who she felt lacked her mother's moral courage, instead dedicating herself to social work and women's education. In a letter from 1945, Elizabeth wrote, "I learned from my mother that true character is revealed not in how we treat our equals or superiors, but in how we respond to those who are vulnerable and have no power to compel our compassion. Mary was powerless in every way that mattered in our world, yet my mother insisted she be treated with dignity and her grief be acknowledged. I have tried to live my life according to that principle, though I fall short daily." Sarah organized an exhibition at the Charleston Historical Society featuring the Hannon family photographs, household records, and contextual materials about domestic service in Appalachian mining communities. The centerpiece was the controversial family portrait, displayed with detailed explanation of what the image revealed about the people involved and the era they inhabited. Visitors could see the progression of photographs showing Mary from her arrival as a frightened orphan teenager through the period following her baby's death, and could read excerpts from letters and documents that provided context for understanding her experience. The exhibition included a section on Catherine Hannon's charitable work and progressive views on women's welfare, challenging simplistic narratives about wealthy mine owner families by showing the complexity of individual actors within those families. Another section traced Mary's later life in Pittsburgh, showing how she had transformed her own painful experiences into compassion for others, creating a legacy of care that extended through her children and grandchildren. The exhibition emphasized that understanding history required moving beyond simple categories of villain and victim to recognize the complicated humanity of all involved. Patricia Sullivan Brennan attended the exhibition opening, bringing Mary's silver locket and several photographs from Mary's later life. She spoke briefly to the assembled historians and community members. "My grandmother never forgot what happened to her in West Virginia, but she also never became bitter or defeated by it. She told us once that the worst things in life can either destroy you or become the foundation for profound compassion, and that we always have a choice about which way we respond." I think Catherine Hannon gave my grandmother something precious during those terrible years, the sense that her grief mattered, that her child's brief life was worthy of remembrance, and that she herself had value beyond her role as a servant. That gift allowed my grandmother to survive and eventually thrive, creating a family and a life filled with love and purpose. The exhibition attracted scholars studying photographic evidence of class relationships, women's historians examining maternal grief and infant mortality, and genealogists tracing their own family histories through the complicated landscapes of early 20th century Appalachia. Several visitors shared their own family stories of servants, scandalous pregnancies, and babies who died young, revealing how common these experiences were and how rarely they were openly discussed or adequately documented. The exhibition created space for acknowledging difficult histories without rendering simplistic judgments, recognizing both the exploitation and cruelty that often characterized wealthy households' treatment of servants, and the occasional instances of genuine compassion that transcended social boundaries. Sarah's research continued beyond the exhibition, expanding to examine other photographic collections from Appalachian wealthy families and looking for similar evidence of servants included in family portraits or other departures from rigid social conventions. She found several additional examples, each with its own story of complicated relationships, tragic losses, and occasional instances of powerful individuals using their privilege to protect rather than exploit those who were vulnerable. These findings supported her argument that while the general pattern of wealthy families exploiting domestic servants was undeniable, individual stories were often more complex, involving real relationships and sometimes genuine care alongside the inherent power imbalances. The mystery of why the original family portrait had been preserved and eventually donated to the Historical Society was solved when the family descendant who had found the glass plates contacted Sarah. He explained that the plates had been specifically marked by Elizabeth Hannon before her death, with instructions that they be preserved and eventually given to a historical society or archive. Elizabeth had apparently understood that the photographs documented something important about her family's history and the era they had lived through, and she wanted that evidence to survive even if it complicated the family's public image. Elizabeth's decision to preserve the photographs represented a final act of honoring both her mother's principles and Mary's experience. By ensuring the images would eventually become part of the historical record, Elizabeth had guaranteed that Mary's grief would be visible to future generations, that the baby who had lived only hours would not be entirely forgotten, and that Catherine Hannon's unusual compassion would be documented alongside the more typical patterns of the era. The photographs became evidence that even in rigid, hierarchical societies, individual moral choices mattered and could create moments of genuine human connection across social boundaries. Sarah concluded her research with a follow-up article examining the broader implications of the Hannon family case for understanding historical power relationships and the role of archives in preserving complicated stories that challenge simplistic narratives. She argued that the family portrait showing Mary holding the baby's gown represented a moment when someone with power, Catherine Hannon, chose to use that power not to erase or hide an inconvenient truth, but to acknowledge it and ensure that a powerless woman's grief was validated and remembered. The photograph had looked peaceful at first glance, showing a wealthy family formally posed in their elegant parlor, maintaining the appearance of propriety and success that was expected of their class and status. Only upon closer examination, zooming in on what the young maid was holding, did the true story emerge, a narrative of loss, grief, and complicated relationships that transcended the formal poses and elaborate costumes. The baby's gown represented a life that had barely begun before ending, a grief that society said Mary had no right to feel or express, and a family's unusual decision to acknowledge rather than erase that grief from their family record. Mary's story, reconstructed from photographs, ledgers, letters, and the memories of her descendants, revealed the limited choices available to young working-class women in early 20th century Appalachia while also documenting the possibility of compassion and support from those with power to provide it. Her survival, recovery, and eventual creation of a loving family in Pittsburgh demonstrated resilience and strength that transcended the tragedy of her youth. The locket she had carried for 60 years, containing the photograph of the baby who had lived and died on October 7, 1919, spoke to the enduring nature of maternal grief while also representing her refusal to be defined solely by loss. Catherine Hannon emerged from the research as a complex figure whose progressive views on women's welfare existed alongside her participation in a social and economic system that exploited workers and concentrated wealth among a small elite. Her decision to support Mary and acknowledge baby Catherine publicly represented genuine compassion, but it occurred within a broader context of power and privilege that allowed her family to profit from the labor of people like Mary's father, who had died in a mine accident while making the Hannons wealthy. The photograph documented Catherine's moral choice in one specific situation, but it could not erase the structural injustices that had shaped Mary's vulnerability in the first place. The baby's headstone in the Hannon family cemetery, with its inscription, "Beloved," and "Forgiven and remembered with love," stood as Catherine's final statement about the situation, that the child had mattered, that the circumstances of her conception did not diminish her worth, and that forgiveness and love were more important than judgment and shame. The stone had weathered over the decades but remained legible, ensuring that anyone who visited the cemetery could see evidence of the child who had been born and died on the same October day in 1919, and could wonder about the story behind such a brief life commemorated with such care. That Sarah's research transformed a single mysterious photograph into a multi-layered narrative about power, gender, class, grief, compassion, and the ways individual moral choices could create moments of genuine human connection even within oppressive social structures. The exhibition and subsequent articles ensured that Mary's story would not be lost, that her grief would be validated and remembered, and that future researchers would have evidence that history was more complicated than simple narratives of exploitation or benevolence suggested. The photograph of the Hannon family, with young Mary standing among them holding the tiny gown, became an important historical document not despite its unusual nature but because of it, providing evidence of how real people navigated impossible situations and sometimes found ways to maintain their humanity and compassion even when social conventions demanded cruelty or indifference. The ongoing interest in the story led to a documentary film project, additional research by other scholars, and continued correspondence between Sarah and Mary's descendants, who shared additional family stories and photographs that filled in details about Mary's life in Pittsburgh and her lasting influence on multiple generations. The silver locket and the photograph it contained were eventually donated to the Historical Society to be displayed alongside the family portrait, allowing visitors to see both the public acknowledgement Catherine Hannon had insisted upon and the private remembrance Mary had carried throughout her long life. In the end, what had appeared at first glance to be a peaceful family portrait revealing nothing unusual became a window into the complicated human realities behind the formal poses and elaborate costumes of early 20th century wealthy Appalachian families. The young maid's presence in the photograph, the baby gown she held so carefully, and the stories revealed through patient historical research transformed the image from a simple piece of family documentation into profound evidence about grief, power, compassion, and the enduring human capacity to recognize each other's pain across social boundaries that were supposed to make such recognition impossible. The photograph ensured that Mary Grace Breslin and baby Catherine Hannon would not be entirely forgotten, that their brief intersection with history would remain visible, and that future generations could learn from their story about the costs of social hierarchies and the possibility, however rare, of compassion transcending power. To uncover more stories that reveal the hidden secrets and forgotten mysteries of the past, leave a like if this deep investigation kept you hooked until the end. I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Did you know that 80% of people who watch aren't subscribed and end up missing incredible stories? It costs nothing. Oh, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and share other dark tales that, in your opinion, deserve to be explored here on the channel. See you soon.